In 1906, the government said new food laws would protect families from danger, and partly they did. But hidden beneath those laws was another change, the slow destruction of old survival knowledge. Before stores, refrigerators, or canned goods, frontier women preserved food using root cellars, smokehouses, lard, and techniques passed down for generations. These methods kept families alive through brutal winters and droughts without modern technology. But between 1906 and 1940, many of those traditions were discouraged, regulated away, or forgotten as grocery stores and factory-made food took over. What was once free knowledge became something people had to buy back. This is the forgotten world they erased. Number 25. Lard sealing, they called it, putting meat down. A cast iron pot of rendered lard, still trembling with heat. Cooked pork, shoulder, loin, rib, packed tight into a stoneware crock, then drowned in that liquid fat until nothing breathed. The lard hardened white and airtight by morning. In the root cellar, it lasted 6 months without a question. On the Great Plains in the 1880s, this was not a recipe. It was February survival. Today's French bistro calls it confit and charges $28 a plate. Grandma just called it putting up the pork. Number 24. Ash-curing wood ash from the fireplace. That was it. Eggs buried in a crock of clean hardwood ash, kept edible for 3 months, sometimes 4. The ash created an alkaline environment, raised the pH around the shell, and sealed the pores against bacteria. Women in Ozark Hill farms and southern Appalachian hollows in the 1860s and 1870s knew this without knowing the chemistry. They just knew it worked. A USDA inspector in 1907 called the practice unsanitary. The science disagreed then. The science disagrees now. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 23. Smoke brining first the brine. Salt water, sometimes with a handful of brown sugar, sometimes with cracked black pepper and dried juniper berries, depending on which immigrant tradition had come through that county. The fish or pork soaked in it for 2 days. Then came the cold smoke, not hot enough to cook, just enough to wrap the meat in phenols and creosote that bacteria cannot survive. Women along the Great Lakes settlements and Pacific Northwest homesteads in the 1870s did not have 2 separate preservation methods. They had one. The salt draws out moisture, and the smoke fills the space where spoilage would have grown. It was not folk magic. It was layered science, practiced by people who had no word for microbiology but understood it in their hands. Number 22. Sulfur dried fruit, a small clay pot. A burning sulfur wick no bigger than your thumb. The apricots or peaches or apple rings went into a sealed wooden barrel. The sulfur wick burned inside it for 20 minutes, and then the fruit went in after, and the barrel was sealed. In California and the Oregon Territory fruit farms of the 1870s, a pound of sulfur cost 2 cents. It preserved a family's entire summer fruit harvest through the following spring. Color intact, flavor bright, mold never touched. The USDA restricted home sulfuring after 1906. Today, sulfur dioxide is used industrially in every commercially dried apricot on every grocery shelf in America. You just can't do it yourself anymore. That is not progress. That is a business model. Number 21. Water glass egg preservation sodium silicate. Sold at the feed store for 10 cents a quart in the 1890s. Mixed with water into a clear, slightly viscous solution and poured over fresh eggs in a stoneware crock. The silicate sealed every pore in every eggshell. Oxygen stayed out. Bacteria stayed out. The eggs stayed fresh for 9 months, sometimes 12. Across the country, Nebraska, Tennessee, Oregon, Pennsylvania, this was the most widely practiced egg preservation technique of the frontier era. The USDA published it in farmers' bulletins, then quietly stopped. By 1950, it was gone from Extension Service literature entirely. Grandma just called it putting up eggs for winter. She was right. Number 20. Root cellar clamping. Here is what the food industry doesn't want you to know about vegetables. They do not need to be refrigerated. They need to be cool, dark, and breathing. Women on Minnesota and Iowa prairie farms in the 1880s understood this so completely that they built entire underground rooms around the principle. The root cellar was not a pantry. It was a controlled atmosphere. Carrots packed in damp sand, layered with straw, held at the naturally occurring underground temperature of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, lasted from October harvest through April mud season without losing their crunch, their sweetness, or their nutrition. The technique they used, packing root vegetables in damp sand with alternating layers of straw to control humidity and prevent the buildup of ethylene gas, was rediscovered by food scientists at Cornell University in 1993 and written up in the Journal of Food Science as a novel approach to extending produce shelf life without refrigeration. Novel, they called it novel, in 1993. Prairie wives had been doing it for 100 years. Beets, turnips, parsnips, celeriac. Each one packed separately, because the gases they released were slightly different, and crossing certain roots could accelerate ripening in the others. A woman who managed a root cellar well in 1885 Iowa knew more practical food science than most people with culinary degrees know today. And she learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, in a chain of knowledge so old it likely crossed the Atlantic twice. The clamping technique required nothing but a hole in the ground, sand, straw, and wooden boards. It cost nothing to run, nothing to maintain. A family of 6 could eat fresh root vegetables all winter for the price of a single afternoon's labor in October. Number 19. Potted meat under butter seal. The meat went in first, slow cooked until it fell apart. Pork most often, sometimes rabbit, sometimes the tougher cuts of venison, shredded fine and packed into a glazed stoneware, crock with salt, cracked pepper, maybe a blade of mace or a pinch of dried thyme if the herb garden had been good that year. Then the clarified butter came, ladled over the top, a full inch of it, still liquid and golden, settling into every gap and crevice until the surface was perfectly sealed and smooth. When that butter hardened, the meat below it was in a world with no oxygen, and without oxygen, nothing could grow. The crock was carried to the cellar shelf, and it stayed there. 6 weeks, 8 weeks. In cool enough conditions, 12 weeks without a question asked. New England farmhouses and mid-Atlantic frontier settlements used this method through the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. A crock of potted pork made from a single hog shoulder cost nothing beyond the hog, and the hog, once slaughtered in November, fed a family in 6 different ways simultaneously. Nothing wasted. Not the fat, not the skin, not the liquid that ran off during the long cook. Today, the precise technique of slow cooking meat and packing it under clarified fat has a French name, rillettes. It is served at bistros in small white crocks with cornichons and toast for $18 a portion. The New England farm wife who made it in 1851 from a hog she had raised herself paid nothing and fed her family for a month. That is not the same thing. That is not even close to the same thing. Number 18. Brine cured butter. A pound of butter and an ounce of salt. That was the formula. Wisconsin and Iowa dairy wives in the 1870s packed fresh churned butter into salt-glazed crocks in alternating layers, butter, salt, pressing out every air pocket with the back of a wooden spoon until the surface was sealed flat and dense. The salt drew out excess moisture, creating a brine that kept bacteria from finding purchase. Stored in the cellar, a crock of salt-packed butter lasted 12 months, sometimes longer. The USDA's 1908 dairy regulations began the slow erosion of this practice, pushing home butter preservation toward commercial refrigeration that most farm families couldn't yet access or afford. Within a generation, the knowledge was classified as dangerous. Within 2 generations, it was gone. Here is what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The cultured salted, aged butter now sold at Whole Foods for $9 a half pound uses the same fundamental principle of salt and controlled fermentation that those farm wives used for free in the 1870s. The same science, the same chemistry, a different price point. Number 17. Fruit butter sealed with wax and spirits apple butter took all day. The apples, cooked down from early morning, skin on, core in, stirred constantly with a long-handled wooden paddle over an outdoor fire, reducing from a heaping iron kettle to a fraction of their original volume, thickening into something dark and spiced and so concentrated with natural sugar that it barely needed preserving at all. But she preserved it anyway because she was not taking chances with February. Hot apple butter poured into a glazed crock. Then a square of cloth soaked in apple brandy, sometimes whiskey, sometimes hard cider, depending on what the farm made, laid flat across the surface. Then a layer of melted beeswax poured over the cloth and sealed to the rim of the crock. 2 antimicrobial barriers. The alcohol killed surface bacteria on contact. The wax sealed out oxygen completely. The high sugar content of the apple butter itself inhibited microbial growth from within. Pennsylvania Dutch country and Ozark homesteads used this method through the 1850s and 1860s. A crock sealed this way kept apple butter edible for 18 months. The technique required no purchased materials beyond the wax, and many families kept their own bees. Alcohol as a preservation seal predates commercial canning by 200 years. It predates the United States by longer than that. Chapter 16. Souse and head cheese in natural aspic nothing left the hog. That was not sentimentality. That was economics sharp enough to cut yourself on. After the hams and shoulders and loins and fatback had been claimed and put up, the head remained. Split, cleaned, simmered for hours with onion and bay leaf and black pepper and vinegar until every shred of meat had released from the bone and the liquid in the pot had become something else. Not broth, but gelatin, trembling and thick, smelling of pork and spice and wood smoke. The meat was picked fine, packed into a small loaf mold or a crock, the liquid strained and poured over. It cooled overnight. By morning it had set into a solid and self-sealed block of pork suspended in its own gelatin, cut in slices, eaten cold with mustard and vinegar. The aspic itself, the natural gelatin rendered from collagen in the bones and skin, created a perfect anaerobic environment as it hardened. No air, no bacteria, no spoilage. German immigrant settlements in the Texas Hill Country and Pennsylvania, German communities, used this through the 1860s and into the early 1900s. The hog's head cost pennies at slaughter, often given away to families who had no cash. Fed a family of 5 for 4 days. A whole animal's worth of nutrition in one dish that required nothing but water, salt, and thyme. Today's chef calls it fromage de tête, plates it in a ring mold with microgreens and whole grain mustard and charges $16. He learned it from a culinary school. She learned it from her grandmother. One of them understood what it meant. The other one prices it. Number 15. Vinegar brined eggs a wide-mouthed jar. A dozen fresh eggs, still warm from the nest. A brine of cider vinegar, water, salt, whole peppercorns, a dried red pepper, and 2 cloves of garlic, brought just to a simmer and then cooled. The eggs went in. The brine covered them completely. The lid went on. The jar went to the cellar shelf, and in 2 weeks the eggs had become something else. Firm, tangy, deeply seasoned through the white, the yolk set but still yielding at the center. Frontier taverns across the Midwest sold them from the bar in the 1870s and 1880s. Farm wives made them to stretch the summer surplus of eggs through the lean months. A dozen eggs cost 8 cents in 1890. A jar of brine eggs made from that dozen lasted 3 months on the shelf without refrigeration. The British kept this tradition alive. Walk into a pub in Yorkshire today and there is still a jar on the bar. In America, the practice was functionally discouraged by USDA food safety guidelines that began in the early 20th century and solidified with FDA pH regulations in the 1980s, which restricted the commercial sale of brined eggs without specific acidification controls. The home practice itself was never technically illegal. It was simply never taught again. And a tradition that isn't taught to the next generation is a tradition that dies in one lifetime. Number 14. Dried bean storage with bay leaves. She didn't know the word eucalyptol. She didn't know linalool. She didn't know that bay laurel leaves contain volatile aromatic compounds that actively repel the Calissobruchus cas maculatus, the bean weevil, and the Cytophilus granarius, the grain weevil, and the Ephestia queniella, the flower moth. She just knew that if you put bay leaves in with your dried beans, the bugs stayed out. She had known it since she was small. Her mother had known it before her. In the territorial homesteads of New Mexico and Arizona in the 1880s and 1890s, a family's dried bean and grain storage was their insurance policy. A 50-pound sack of pinto beans, 3 cents a pound, represented months of protein. Losing it to weevils was not an inconvenience. It was hunger. The bay leaf system. Layers of dried leaves alternated with layers of beans in clay jars or wooden casks, sealed with cloth, kept that storage intact through the summer heat with no chemical intervention. In 1995, researchers at the University of Alexandria published findings in the Journal of Stored Products Research, confirming that bay laurel leaf compounds showed significant repellent activity against stored grain pests. Significant. As if this were news. As if somewhere in New Mexico in 1887, a woman had not already written this conclusion in the language of a full bean crock in February. Number 13. Rendered tallow dipping. The cattle drive from Texas to Abilene, Kansas was 1,000 miles. It took 2 to 3 months on foot. The cowboys who made it needed meat that would not rot in the summer heat, tied to a saddle or packed in a wagon with no shade and no cool. Rendered beef tallow, hard, white, nearly waterproof at room temperature, was the answer. A cut of beef was cooked until its surface was fully sealed, then dipped in hot liquid tallow and held until the fat hardened around it in a shell. Sometimes dipped twice. Sometimes 3 times until the coating was a 1/4 inch thick. That shell blocked oxygen completely. In the shade of a wagon cover, in temperatures below 90 degrees, a tallow-dipped cut of beef lasted 2 to 3 weeks without spoilage. Texas ranchers and Wyoming and Montana frontier families used this through the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. Cowboys called it casing a cut. The technique required nothing but the fat, rendered from the same animal the meat came from. It cost nothing. It worked. The refrigerated rail car came through in the 1880s, and within a decade the tallow technique was gone. Not because it failed, but because Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour had built a refrigerated transport empire that required you to ship meat their way, on their schedule, and pay their rates. Grandma just called it putting up the beef. The cattle barons called it competition. Number 12. Pickling in salt brine without vinegar lacto-fermentation. That is the name food scientists gave it in the 20th century. In the German immigrant communities of Wisconsin and Minnesota in the 1870s, in the Jewish immigrant neighborhoods of New York and Chicago in the 1880s, in the Pennsylvania Dutch farmsteads going back to the 1840s. Nobody called it lacto-fermentation. They called it making pickles. They called it putting up cucumbers. They called it the crock. Salt and water. That was it. No vinegar, no sugar, no citric acid from a bottle. Cucumbers, or green beans, or beets, or cabbage, or a dozen other vegetables, submerged in a brine of 1 tablespoon of non-iodized salt per cup of water, weighted down with a stone or a plate to keep them below the surface, covered with a cloth, and left to ferment at room temperature for 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on the season and what you were making. The salt suppressed the harmful bacteria. The lactobacillus bacteria, already present on the vegetable surface, thrived in the salt brine and produced lactic acid. The lactic acid dropped the pH. The low pH preserved everything. The vegetables lasted months. The brine itself, tangy, deeply savory, full of live cultures, was drunk as a tonic, poured into soups used to cure the next batch. Modern gastroenterologists now understand that the live lactobacillus cultures produced in traditional lacto-fermentation are among the most beneficial things a human gut can receive. Probiotics. We now pay $4 for a small bottle of probiotic supplement. She made it in a crock for the cost of salt and time. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 11. Corn drying and parching green corn came in August. The problem was January. Between those 2 months was everything a frontier family needed to solve. Drying corn was not optional. It was the difference between eating and not eating in a cold weather state. But there were ways to dry it and ways to dry it. The simplest, ears of field corn left in their husks. The husks pulled back and braided together, hung in long ropes from the rafters of the barn or the porch eaves, turning slowly in the autumn wind until the kernels were hard as gravel and rattled when you shook them. This corn kept for 2 years without degradation. Ground into cornmeal as needed, reconstituted in soups and stews. Nothing added, nothing lost except moisture. But parched corn was different. Parched corn was genius. Dried kernels spread thin in a cast-iron skillet over medium heat, stirred constantly until they began to blister and pop and turn a deep golden brown. Not quite popcorn, not quite anything you've eaten in modern life. The dry heat drove off the last trace of moisture and created a Maillard reaction across the surface of every kernel that both deepened the flavor and created a surface layer that insects and mold could not penetrate. Cherokee and Choctaw communities in the southeastern United States had been parching corn for centuries before European settlement. Frontier wives in Kentucky and Tennessee learned it from indigenous neighbors, adapted it to their own hearths, and fed their families with it through winters when flour was gone and everything else had been eaten. A bushel of field corn cost 15 cents in 1885. Parched and stored in a dry ceramic jar, it lasted 18 months and could be eaten dry, ground into meal, or reconstituted in boiling water. That is not a survival food. That is a food that survived everything thrown at it. Number 10. Kvass fermentation for bread preservation. She didn't throw away stale bread. She never threw away stale bread. In Russian and Eastern European immigrant communities in the mining towns of Pennsylvania and the industrial neighborhoods of Chicago and Detroit in the 1890s and early 1900s, stale black bread went into a ceramic crock with water and a pinch of salt, sometimes a handful of raisins or a cube of raw beet, and it sat at room temperature for 2 days. The wild yeasts on the bread crust colonized the liquid. The sugars in the bread fermented. What came out was kvass, a tart, slightly effervescent, low-alcohol beverage that tasted of dark bread and earth and something almost caramel. Kvass extended the bread. Instead of going moldy on a shelf, stale bread became a drink, a soup base, a vinegar if left longer. Nothing wasted. Not a crust, not a crumb, not the water the bread soaked in. A loaf of black bread cost 5 cents in 1895. The kvass made from its stale remnants kept a family hydrated through the week and provided B vitamins and lactobacillus cultures that helped their bodies absorb the nutrients in everything else they ate. Today, kvass has been discovered by the craft beverage industry. It sells in 16-ounce bottles at specialty grocery stores for $6.89. The label calls it ancient and artisanal. It is. It's also what a coal miner's wife made from bread that would have otherwise gone to the slop bucket. Number 9. Curing in maple sugar. Before white sugar arrived in volume on the frontier, before brown sugar was cheap and available, the Great Lakes region and the northeastern frontier states had something older and more abundant: maple sugar. Hard-packed, dark, intensely flavored, with an antimicrobial profile that white sugar cannot match, because maple sugar retains trace minerals and phenolic compounds from the sap that refined sugar has had processed out of it. Women in Vermont, upstate New York, and the Michigan territories in the 1840s and 1850s cured meats and preserved fruits in hard-packed maple sugar. A ham rubbed with maple sugar and salt and left to cure for 3 weeks in the cold of the root cellar came out sweet and dark and flavored in a way that no modern grocery store ham can replicate, because no modern grocery store ham was cured with real maple sugar and 6 weeks of patience. The process required no purchased ingredients for families in maple country. The trees gave the sugar, the cellar gave the temperature. The time cost nothing. By 1910, industrial white sugar was cheap enough to undercut maple sugar in most markets, and the technique faded because the primary ingredient became a specialty item instead of a free one. The knowledge went with it. Here is what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Refined white sugar has significantly lower antimicrobial properties than the unrefined maple sugar it replaced in American preservation traditions. They sold you a product that worked less well and called it modern. Number 8, burying in oats eggs again. Because eggs were always the problem, plentiful in summer, almost impossible to come by in deep winter when hens stopped laying, and expensive to replace. A Dakota Territory wife in the 1880s who let her summer eggs go to waste was making a decision she would regret in December: burial in dry oats. A wooden cask or a deep ceramic crock lined with a thick layer of raw dry oats. Eggs placed large end down, because the air cell at the large end needed to stay at the top, away from the yolk, to slow internal deterioration. More oats poured over, another layer of eggs. More oats to the top, sealed with a lid, stored in the coolest part of the cellar. The oats absorbed ambient moisture and kept the eggs in a consistently dry, slightly cool microclimate. The shells stayed sealed. The interior deterioration slowed dramatically. Eggs preserved in oats this way lasted 4 to 5 months, enough to carry the gap between the last summer laying and the first winter clutch. The oats themselves were not wasted. Used afterward in porridge, in bread, in horse feed. Nothing wasted. Not ever. That was not a philosophy. That was arithmetic. Number 7, potting in goose fat lard was for pork country. In the river settlements of the French immigrant communities along the Mississippi, St. Genevieve in Missouri, Kaskaskia in Illinois, the Bayou parishes of Louisiana, the fat of choice was goose. Geese were kept for eggs, for down, and ultimately for their extraordinary fat yield. A single large goose rendered nearly 2 pounds of fat, clear and ivory-colored, with a higher monounsaturated fat content than either lard or beef tallow, and a smoke point that made it nearly imperishable at cellar temperatures. Goose fat sealed crocks of slow-cooked duck, pork, and goose itself, the original confit of Gascon, France, transplanted to American river country and adapted to what the land provided. The technique was the same. Cook the meat low and slow in its own fat, pack it into a vessel, submerge it under rendered fat, seal, and store. The fat hardened, the meat inside kept. 6 months. 8 months. The river settlement families who did this in the 1840s and 1850s were practicing a preservation tradition that was already 400 years old when they arrived in America. It was not poor food. This is not poor food. Poor food is the shrink-wrapped, sodium phosphate-injected, shelf-stable meat product that replaced this. That is poor food. What she made in a crock of goose fat was something that has never been adequately replaced by anything the food industry sells. Number 6, drying herbs in salt the herb garden gave everything in summer and nothing in winter. The solution was simple and old. Pack fresh herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary, oregano, summer savory, in alternating layers with coarse salt in a small ceramic jar. Press each layer tight to force out air, seal with cloth, and store in the cool dark. The salt pulled the moisture from the herb and preserved both the color and the volatile aromatic oils that give each herb its flavor. The resulting salt became an herb salt. Concentrated, intensely flavored, usable in cooking all winter long. In Italian immigrant communities across the mining towns of West Virginia and the factory neighborhoods of New Jersey in the 1890s and early 1900s, salt-preserved herbs were the backbone of winter cooking. The preserved thyme that went into the bean soup in February was the same thyme that had been growing 6 inches from the back door in July. Nothing purchased, nothing processed, nothing lost. Today, freeze-dried herbs in plastic jars sit on every grocery store spice rack. They are pale, weakly flavored, expensive per ounce, and stripped of most of the volatile oil compounds that make fresh herbs culinarily valuable. A jar of salt-preserved summer thyme made by an Italian farmwife in 1897 West Virginia was better in every measurable way. She knew it. She just didn't have a food science PhD to say so. Number 5. Smoking over corncob wood was not always available in abundance on the open prairie. What was always available after the corn harvest was corncobs. Dry, dense, slow-burning corncobs, stripped of their kernels and left in the sun for a week, produced a smoke that was mild, sweet, faintly nutty, and deeply effective as a preservation medium. Homesteaders in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Oklahoma Territory in the 1880s and 1890s built small backyard smokehouses, sometimes nothing more than a barrel with a lid and a pipe running into it from a small fire pit, and smoked fish, sausage, ham, and cheese over corncob fires that cost nothing to fuel. The phenolic compounds in corncob smoke are slightly different from oak or hickory smoke. Lighter, less resinous, producing a finished product that kept for 6 to 8 weeks without refrigeration and tasted of something specific and unrepeatable that no modern smoker using purchased wood chips can fully copy. Grandma just called it smokehouse sausage. The specialty food industry now markets corncob smoked artisan meats at $32 a pound at farmers markets in cities where people have never seen a corncob fire. They are chasing something real. They just don't always know where it came from. Number 4. Honey sealing honey does not spoil. Archaeologists have found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still edible. The reason is chemistry. Honey's water activity is so low that bacteria cannot reproduce in it. Its pH is acidic enough to inhibit most lat pathogens, and it produces trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide as a byproduct of its enzyme activity. Frontier wives in Appalachian Tennessee, the Kentucky Hill Country, and the Carolina Piedmont in the 1840s and 1850s, places where wild bees were plentiful and honey was a farm product rather than a purchased luxury, knew this and they used it. Fruits preserved in honey, nuts sealed under honey for winter, cooked meat covered in a thin layer of honey to extend its edible life by a week in the summer heat, fresh cheese submerged in honey to prevent the surface mold that would otherwise claim it within days. The technique was older than Christianity, older than Rome, old as the first human who tasted honey from a wild hive and noticed that the comb beside it, even in summer, did not rot. A pound of raw honey in the 1850s Appalachian farmstead cost nothing if you kept bees. If you bought it, it cost 8 to 12 cents. For that investment, you preserved 20 pounds of summer fruit through the winter. The math has not changed. The knowledge has been replaced with something that costs considerably more and works considerably less. Number 3. Beeswax-coated cheese. The cheese wheel came out of the press, still yielding, still white, still too young to cut, and she coated it. Melted beeswax, applied with a cloth or a stiff brush, layer by layer while the cheese was still cool, building up a shell that hardened amber and smooth and utterly impermeable to air, to mold, to anything that might want to enter from the outside. Then it went to the cellar shelf to age. In dairy farming communities in Vermont, Wisconsin, and upstate New York in the 1860s and 1870s, a properly waxed wheel of hard cheese lasted 6 months in cellar conditions, a year, sometimes longer. The wax did not flavor the cheese. It simply sealed it, created a controlled environment where the cheese could age in its own gases, developing complexity and sharpness month by month, while the outside world was held at arm's length. Commercial cheesemakers abandoned beeswax for synthetic wax and then for vacuum-sealed plastic packaging across the mid-20th century. The reason was cost and speed, not quality. Beeswax-aged cheese is better. Every cheesemaker who works with it knows it. The artisan cheese industry has rediscovered beeswax rind aging in the last 20 years and charges premium prices for wheels aged the way Vermont farm wives aged them, for free in the 19th century. That is not innovation. That is reinvention of a wheel that was never broken. Number 2. Drying in the sun on muslin, the sun was free. Muslin was cheap, 12 cents a yard in the 1880s, and a yard went a long way. Stretched over a simple wooden frame, tacked tight at the edges, set in the full afternoon sun on a south-facing hillside. A muslin drying rack was the simplest, most effective food preservation technology the American frontier ever produced, and it required almost no investment and almost no skill beyond patience. Sliced apples, thin as a finger, halved apricots, cut side up, whole cherry tomatoes, green beans strung on thread and laid across the muslin, strips of venison or beef, cut against the grain and laid flat in the morning sun, turned at midday, brought in before the evening dew. In the dry air of Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and the Western Territories in the 1870s and 1880s, a day of good sun turned fresh produce into something that lasted a year in a cloth bag in the cellar. The women who managed summer drying operations fed their families from those cloth bags through January, February, March. They reconstituted dried apples into pie filling. They crumbled dried tomatoes into winter stews. They ground dried beans into flour when the grain ran out. The muslin frame cost pennies. The sun was free. The knowledge of what to dry, how thin to cut it, when to bring it in, how to tell if the moisture was truly out. That knowledge was passed mother to daughter and neighbor to neighbor in a chain that stretched back through every dry climate civilization that ever existed, and was broken in America somewhere between the introduction of the electric dehydrator and the moment we decided that convenience was worth more than competence. Number 1, the crock itself. Everything else on this list was a technique. The crock was a philosophy. Glazed stoneware. 2 gallons, sometimes 3. Heavy enough that you needed both hands and a firm stance to move it. It sat in the same corner of the root cellar, in the same farmhouses of the Midwest and the South and the Eastern Seaboard, from the time the family arrived until the time the house fell down or was sold. It was the center of gravity of the preservation kitchen. Everything flowed toward it and out of it. In the crock went the brine for the cucumbers, the brine for the beans, the sauerkraut that would ferment for 3 weeks and emerge tart and alive and full of everything the gut needed to survive winter on a diet of dried meat and cornbread, the pork packed in lard, the eggs packed in water glass, the apple butter sealed with wax, the potted meat sealed with butter. The crock held all of it, one season into the next, year after year, decade after decade. The crock was not a container. It was a relationship with food that has no adequate modern equivalent. It required you to know your food, to smell it, to taste it, to understand what it was doing at every stage of its preservation, and to intervene at the right moment or to leave it alone at the right moment, and to know which was which. That knowledge was not written down in most cases. It lived in hands and noses and taste buds, and the accumulated experience of women who had been doing this their entire lives and learning it from women who had been doing it their entire lives before them. The food industry did not simply replace the crock. It replaced the knowledge the crock required. It told us the crock was dangerous, the crock was unsanitary, the crock was the past. It gave us the can, sealed in a factory, processed at temperatures that killed not just bacteria but flavor and nutrition alike, requiring no knowledge, no attention, no relationship with the food inside. Just a can opener, just a purchase, and we believed them, not because we were stupid, because we were busy and tired and the can was easy, and easy has its own logic when you are working 12 hours a day. But something left with the crock, something that we do not have a clean word for. A competence, a confidence, a daily intimacy with the processes of life and death and transformation that happen when you take raw food and make it keep. We lost that. We were helped to lose it. And the companies that helped us lose it built billion-dollar businesses on the absence they created. She was right. Everything she knew was right. The lard seal, the brine barrel, the wax-sealed crock, the bay leaves in the bang jar, the ash-berried egg, the tallow-dipped beef that rode 1,000 miles tied to a saddle. All of it was right. All of it worked. And all of it was ours until we were convinced to give it away. Closing. Pick up a crock this week. Find one at an estate sale, a thrift store, the back of a relative's cabinet. Feel the weight of it. That weight is not just clay. That's what self-sufficiency felt like when it was the only option. Try the water glass eggs. Try the salt-packed herbs. Try the lacto-fermented cucumbers in a mason jar on your counter for 5 days with nothing but salt and water and thyme, and taste what happens. And know that what you are tasting is not a trend and not a recipe from a food blog. It is a direct line to a woman in Nebraska in 1887 who fed 7 people through 5 months of winter without a single trip to a store. These grandmothers, frontier wives, immigrant mothers, sharecropper women, ranch wives, coal miners' wives, they were not surviving. They were practicing a mastery so complete and so ordinary to them that they never thought to call it skill. It was just Tuesday. It was just winter. It was just what you did because you knew how, because someone who loved you had made sure you knew how. The USDA didn't make their food safer. H.J. Heinz didn't make their food better. Campbell's didn't improve on the brine barrel. They made their knowledge illegal, inconvenient, and eventually invisible, and they charged us for the replacement for the next 120 years. That is not progress. That is the longest-running sales pitch in American history. Tell me in the comments which one your grandmother made. I want to know what is still alive out there. What is still being passed, hand to hand, against all the odds, in kitchens they haven't gotten to yet.